Hi, my name is Delaney Davies, and today I'll be making smoothest ever truffles, and I'll be testing the difference between using amaretto and then not using amaretto. And I think that the one recipe I use amaretto on will be smoother. My ingredients are pecans, butter, salt, semi-sweet chocolate, 10 ounces of semi-sweet chocolate, 6 ounces of milk chocolate, 5 large egg yolks, heavy cream, and liqueur. And I specifically used amaretto. So the very first step is to preheat your oven to 350 and then to roast your pecans until lightly brown for about 10 to 12 minutes. And then once you've done that, you remove them and then you put them in with 3 tablespoons of butter and salt, and you let them sit until cool to the touch. And then once they're cool to the touch, you go ahead and blend them up. Since I doubled the recipe, I went ahead and just did all of that part together. And so I did 4 cups of pecans, 6 tablespoons of butter, and a half teaspoon of salt. Then up next, it was time to weigh out my chocolate and to blend up my chocolate. So earlier I showing that I had 10 ounces of the semi-sweet chocolate. And for the semi-sweet chocolate, I used Hershey's dark chocolate. And then I used Hershey's milk chocolate for my milk chocolate. And I did 10 ounces and 6 ounces of both of those respectively. And I did it twice in order to get my 2 different recipes. Then I blended those up, and that actually took quite a bit of time, and I ended up having to pulse it. So I would, instead of just letting it go, because it wasn't really blending evenly when I was just letting the blender run. Then I got my egg yolks and I was ready to start the cooking process. So here I added my 5 large egg yolks, and I added my heavy cream, so my 1/4 of a cup of heavy cream, and I was heating that on low heat in an 8-inch skillet, and I was stirring that constantly until I felt thickening. So it's important to make sure that the second you feel thickening, you go ahead and take it off of the stovetop, because if you start to feel thickening, it means it's at the right temperature, but you don't want it to go too much over that, or you could risk having it start to bond together and kind of coagulate, so essentially forming like scrambled eggs. So you want to make sure that the second you feel that thickening, you're taking it off that heat so that you can prevent that and it doesn't happen to you. Once I was done with my egg yolks and my heavy cream had kind of combined, I would then add 4 tablespoons of butter and stir well. And then once that was melted, I would add the chocolate and the liqueur for this first recipe. In the second recipe, I don't add the liqueur, I just add the chocolate. Another thing about blending up the chocolate from the step or before this is that doing that will kind of help you have consistent pieces that are small and melt easily. So if there are too many big pieces in your chocolate when you're melting it, those don't melt as quickly as your smaller pieces, and then you're having uneven melting. And this uneven melting can kind of result in certain pieces of chocolate to get too hot and to burn, and so then your chocolate mixture is essentially ruined because you've burned your chocolate and you can't really go back from that. So that's why it's super important to have your chocolate be small and consistent things, is to decrease the melting time, and to ensure that you're actually getting it melted by the time it doesn't get too cool. And then also to prevent that burning and from kind of ruining your recipe. Another thing about the chocolate is we used semi-sweet chocolate, and semi-sweet chocolate contains like an emulsifier, and then it also has vanilla added into it, but it doesn't contain sugar. And so that's kind of what the difference is. And then with milk chocolate, it has sugar in it. It has vanilla, sugar, and then it also contains like a dairy product. And so that's kind of how I got it name of milk chocolate, is because it has that dairy product in it. And that's kind of why you would have your milk chocolate and then your semi-sweet chocolate. Another thing about this whole recipe is that it is very easy to kind of mess it up. So chocolate melt goes from like a solid to a liquid with in between just a few degrees. And the melting point actually happens to be your body temperature, which is why when you put like chocolate in your mouth or when you put chocolate in your hand, it melts. That's because it's warming, your body temperature is warming it up and melting it. Some things you have to look out for is that you want your chocolate to melt at 118 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but if it goes above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, then it is likely to seize. And seizing is the moment where you have your creamy melted chocolate, and then like the next moment, it's a solid like grainy mess is how it's described in the book. And that chocolate will not melt. And so if you get it too hot, you have to basically restart because you can't not save that. And you can strain it off and you can get the melted part of the chocolate, but you will essentially not have a full thing because you can get the cocoa butter part of it, but you can't get like the cocoa part of it. Another way to actually prevent seizing is adding water. So the recipe in this calls for, so the rule of thumb when making truffles specifically is a tablespoon of liquid for every 2 ounces of chocolate. So on average, I have about 16.5 ounces of chocolate. And for my very first recipe I made, the one with amaretto, I had 9 tablespoons of water. And that kind of came from 3 tablespoons in the cream, the tablespoon in the butter, the 2 tablespoons of the amaretto, and then the 3 tablespoons from the egg yolks. In the second recipe that I don't add amaretto, I don't add anything else to balance this out. And instead of having 9 tablespoons, so essentially completing that 2-to-1 ratio, I had 7 tablespoons. And so it was less than a 2-to-1 ratio. And therefore it didn't melt as correctly. It took a lot longer to melt. And I had to put it on the heat because by the time that I would get it to there, it was already cooling down so much that I needed it to warm up just a little bit more. And so I'd put it on the heat for like just a second or so, and then I would take it back off and then like stir it until it mixed, just so that I could get to the point of my chocolate actually melting most of the way through, and then without kind of preventing that seizing. Another thing that can actually cause seizing is adding cold ingredients, which is why it's super important to heat up your egg and cream, and then to have your like butter be at room temperature, and to have your chocolate and your amaretto be both at room temperature or pretty close to room temperature. Real quick, I'm gonna go back to when I was heating the egg yolks and the cream. You do this to also to heat it up, one, but then to also prevent the threat of salmonella. I use my homemade great from collected eggs. So I trust them, but I didn't want to like mess with the recipe, and I also thought it was better than to take the risk of like having salmonella potentially. So I just went ahead and heated those up, even though I do trust those eggs to not have any dangers contributed with them. It also should help with the melting of the chocolate. So since I did that, just to make sure that like my chocolate melted easier. And in the first recipe, it did melt very easy and like according to how the book kind of describes it. And so I contribute that to like the egg yolks heating it up and the water to chocolate ratio being correct. So as that's going, once it was completely melted, I let it sit for about a minute. And then once it was done, I set it in my refrigerator and let it sit. I think I left it for about like 3 to 4 hours, if I'm remembering correctly. I think it was about 3.5 actually. So once that's done, the very next step is to take your spoon and to scoop it up. I just used like a regular spoon, and then I get into about 1-inch balls, and then you roll them up into your chopped pecans from the night before, and then that's how you get your truffle. Once my truffles were done, I did make sure to put them back into the fridge, like in between making them, because I had them both sitting out, and then I noticed that they kind of started warm and they were kind of hard to work with. And so in between working with them, I would just switch back and forth, having them be on separate like places. And then in between working with one, I would switch out. I would put the other in the fridge and letting it kind of stay cool and not melt on me, essentially. So here you can see my finished products. The one that was kind of more rough shaped was the chocolate that didn't, was this one that without that water. And you can all kind of tell that it did not melt properly because of the lack of amaretto and the lack of additional water. If I was to make this recipe again and I didn't want to add liquor to it, I think I would just replace those 2 tablespoons of water with just regular water. But here I'm making it, and so I'm gonna go ahead and skip to my results. So the alcohol one ended up being what I would describe as like a truffle consistency. It had that dip to it. When you bit into it, it was really creamy, but it was like hard kind of shell, not really hard shell, but like a firmer shell, and then you bit into it and it was super creamy. Whereas the non-alcoholic one, no one else felt this, but I thought it tasted more like a fudge. Like it was closer to a fudge consistently. So kind of like if a fudge and a truffle had like a baby. And I kind of attribute that to it just not being fully melted when it was done. It was also like overwhelmingly, most people liked the non-alcohol taste better. They said that the alcohol taste was super strong and that they couldn't really get over it. And so that kind of messed with their preferences. Also, the alcohol one was smoother like I had predicted. Like I said earlier, the non-alcoholic took a very, very long time to melt. So it doesn't really show up on the video because I cut it correctly into a way that it wouldn't show up as badly. But it just took a very long time. That is the non-alcoholic. And then the second one is the first one is the non-alcoholic. And you can kind of see that droop effect. This is my finished product. And that's it. Thank you.